Whenever there is snow in the landscape, I am eager to head out with my camera and experience those absolutely magical conditions. It definitely gives us the opportunity to capture some wonderful photographs. However, I feel that there's a number of things we need to be aware of, both technically and artistically too, in order to get the best photographs. In this video, I'm going to cover 6 points which I think are really important and will hopefully help you capture better photographs next time you are out in the snow. Before I get into the actual 6 points that I want to cover in this video, I just want to quickly say that I personally don't think photography has got too many rules or instructions that we absolutely must follow. I think there's different ways and many different ways of doing things actually when it comes to photography. So like in all my videos, whenever I talk about something, there are definitely things that work for me, and I do these things that I'm going to talk about every time I'm out photographing in snow. But as I say, they're just things that work for me, and hopefully you can pick up a few tips from this video and they'll help you next time you're out photographing in the snow. So the first suggestion I want to offer in this video for shooting in the snow is that if you're not already doing so, make sure you shoot your images or that your camera records them in the RAW file format. Now, shooting in RAW offers a number of benefits. I won't go into all of those in this video, but to my mind, when I'm shooting in snowy conditions, shooting in RAW file format offers 2 main benefits. The first is that it can be tricky to get the overall exposure and brightness of your image correct when shooting in snowy conditions. So as long as you're shooting in RAW, when it comes to post-processing your images, you've got much more leeway regarding things such as your exposure, your shadows, and your highlights. You can really get the image looking the way you want it in post-production. The next thing that can be quite problematic in snowy conditions is getting your white balance correct. Now, white balance can either be technically accurate or subject to personal preference. We can obviously tweak that if we want to in post-production if we shoot in the RAW file format. And I think that's a big advantage when shooting in snowy conditions. You may want your snow being pure white, you may want it being slightly cooler. And as long as you're shooting in the RAW file format, you have the ability to tweak that and get it just the way you want later on. On to my next point, and it can be difficult to get your exposure correct when you're shooting a snow-covered landscape. If perhaps you're shooting in a camera mode, which lets the camera set the exposure of your photograph for you, or if you're shooting in manual mode and making an exposure based on the camera's light meter, you may find that your image out of the camera is underexposed. Due to how a camera's metering system works, they tend to underexpose when the vast majority of your scene is white. At the other end of the spectrum, you definitely don't want to overexpose your snowy scenes. Although snow is white and often bright, there is detail in it, and if you overexpose it, it will look far too bright and blown out in your photograph. Fortunately, there are a number of ways to fix this. For me, the easiest is to take control of the exposure myself and base it on the histogram rather than the light meter. For snowy scenes, and because I am shooting in RAW and have lots of room to make adjustments later, I like to expose to the right. So I brighten my exposure and I push my histogram to the right, but I stop at the point just before it clips the highlights. The overall shape of a histogram will change based on the scene you're photographing, of course, but I'll put up an example to show how far to the right I will push it, and also an example of pushing it too far, which I definitely don't want to do. The histogram you see on your camera is based on the JPEG picture profile that you have set, not on the actual RAW image itself. I know my camera well, and even if my in-camera histogram is saying I've clipped the highlights just a tiny bit, I know that my RAW file will be perfectly okay. When photographing in snow though, I do try to avoid pushing the histogram too far to the right where I'm actually clipping the highlights. The standard histogram that we're used to seeing is based on luminosity, but I also like to do a second check on the RGB histogram that my camera offers, and this shows the red, green and blue color channels. If no channels are clipping, I know the photograph is fine. If only one channel clips and it's just a tiny bit, I'm not too concerned about that because again I am shooting in the RAW format and this is a JPEG representation. However, if a channel has a large amount of clipping or multiple channels are clipping, then I will back down my exposure a bit. So those are the steps that I follow, and it always gives me the best exposure on my RAW files from which to begin my post-processing later. So the next point that I want to talk about in this video is the importance of light and of observing the light when you're out taking photographs in the snow. Snow is obviously white, it can be quite bright, and when a light hits it, or sunlight, bright sunlight hits it, it can give off quite a glare, and that can be quite distracting and not a very nice look in your images. So light can be both an advantage and a disadvantage. If it's a light that's complementary to your scene, perhaps quite a soft light, and the light is falling on the correct areas that you want the viewer's eye to be drawn to, then it's a positive. If the light is too bright or on the wrong areas and it pulls the viewer's eye to the wrong area of your image, it's definitely a negative, a disadvantage. So light is really important when the landscape is covered in snow. I'm always observing the light when I'm out photographing in snowy conditions. So I want to talk about light a bit more. We'll have a look at a few images to do that on the computer. And the first image that I want to show you is an example of where light didn't work for the scene. This scene is a composition that I quite like. There's a small tree growing and it's surrounded by three much older trees in fairly close proximity. The backdrop looked beautiful and there are a number of other features which I really liked but I won't go into depth on in this video. So as I stood here, I could see that the light was slowly moving through the woodland, initially from the backdrop, and it was definitely heading towards the front of my image. So I could see that there was a strong chance that the small tree and the three surrounding ones would get touched by light and therefore stand out and separate from the background. Perhaps I was hoping for a little too much. My vision came close, but it never actually happened. I got light on the three larger trees, but unfortunately the smaller one didn't receive any light. As you can see, light fell on the branch to the left and it pulls the viewer's eye to that side of the image. Whereas if the light had fallen on the small tree itself, I think the scene would have worked really well. As is, this photograph doesn't work for me and it's all due to how the light is. Moving on, this is an image with much more subtle light, which is something I quite like. The composition is strong and the small snow-covered trees and bushes to the right in the foreground have got a touch more light on them than the background, so they subtly stand out. Also, the path leads off into the scene, into an area which has some light showing between the dark tree trunks, which is very effective for leading your eye through to that spot. This image has much more noticeable light, but because I've got the exposure correct at capture, it works well. The sun is creating some wonderful light, and with the help of the trees, some really nice shadows as well. The light is coming diagonally across the scene and giving some really nice highlights to the right side of the central snow and ice covered tree, and also on the snow around it. The light in this scene is much more subtle, but it's still very effective. The main subject has some soft lighting on it, which makes it stand out from the backdrop, and the soft light has worked really well for showing the contours and textures in the foreground. I'm not sure how well they will come across in this video, which of course will be compressed, but looking at the original image, the effect is really nice and it wouldn't have been present had I overexposed the image. There's also a gentle glow coming through the trees at the top left. So again, there is no distracting light in the photograph and the soft light works really well. Similar to the previous image, again soft light with a gentle glow through the background trees has worked very well for this photograph. Hopefully you can imagine that if there were some bright patches of light in the wrong areas of this photograph, it just wouldn't have worked as well. And finally for light, a vista shot taking in a large area where light played a very important part in taking what I feel is a successful photograph. A lot of the foreground is in shade, which leaves your eyes to wander off into the distance, following the light and the patterns in the landscape, and finally reaching the mountains which are being touched by the sunlight. So the next point that I want to talk about in this video is regarding footprints, both those that I could potentially leave myself and also those that have already been left by other people or prints that could have been left by animals. So regarding trying to capture a scene which has not got footprints in it, for example, there may have been a fresh snowfall and you're trying to capture a scene in which the snow is pristine and untouched. You obviously need to be very careful and thoughtful regarding where you're actually walking yourself and the potential footprints that you could leave. So I like to walk around quite slowly and thoughtfully when I'm photographing in the snow. And if I see a potential composition up ahead or off to the side of me that I think may work, I like to just stop in my tracks and give myself perhaps a minute or so just to have a look at the scene and think about where I may want to take the shot from, or indeed if I need to explore the scene a bit more from different angles. And I'm trying to visualize the areas that could potentially be in my photograph, and I definitely don't want to walk in those areas and make any footprints there. So it's really good just to slow down and think a bit and be very careful and just slowly approach the actual area from which you're going to finally take the photograph from, and perhaps set up your tripod if you're going to use a tripod. So that's regarding trying to get a scene in which the snow looks pristine and there's no footprints in it. But conversely, I often like to take photographs in which the snow actually does show footprints if they work with the scene. I think a lot of people don't like to take a scene of snow if it's been disturbed and there's some footprints or perhaps animal prints there, but I definitely think this can be an asset if it works with the scene. And generally, for it to work with a scene that I'm taking, I look for two things. The first is that the footprints need to be generally quite tidy in their appearance and obviously in the correct place. And the second thing is that I like if the footprints are, generally speaking, leading into the scene rather than the person has been walking out of the scene or towards my camera. So I'll show you a few examples and how I think footprints have worked quite well for me. I took this shot early in the morning, and before I had arrived, someone had already walked through the scene with their dog. In this case, the footprints are fairly tidy and they lead off into the distance. For me, this works and adds a story to the image. It's early on a winter's morning and someone has been out near sunrise and enjoyed a walk through this woodland with their dog. In this next photograph, I believe we have the prints from two animals. The ones on the left are definitely leading into the shot, so the animal has walked in that direction. Again, this is another early morning shot. There are no human footprints in sight, but we have the tracks from two animals, so I feel it adds a little something to the image, and it tells a story and it leaves the viewer wondering. So the next thing that I want to talk about in this video is capturing falling snow and the potential shutter speeds you may need to use in order to do that. So I think capturing falling snow is certainly very effective, and it certainly captures the atmosphere of that moment at which you are taking the photograph. I'm trying to do one of two things. I'm either trying to freeze the falling snow so it actually looks like snowflakes, or I'm trying to capture the movement of the snow, the actual streaks of the snow as it falls down. Whichever of the two you prefer is purely down to personal preference, but the key is using and controlling your shutter speed. So I'm going to have a look at a few examples on the computer and show you how I've tackled that. This is a close-up of part of an image taken at 1/200th of a second. I needed to use an ISO of 5000 to achieve this, and you can see the individual snowflakes. This, however, is the full version of the entire photograph with the look that I wanted captured at a different shutter speed. The snow was falling very quickly and it was blizzard-like conditions, and this is the look of the photo that I wanted to achieve for this scene. I love this photo and it was captured at 1/15th of a second. For me, it really shows the atmosphere of a moment, the likes of which I don't experience very often. I really like this photograph as well. It's an unusual mix of golden light and heavy snowfall. This one was captured at 1/125th of a second. And finally, this photo here was taken at 1/250th of a second. It's just a snapshot. I saw some potential here, but I would have required my telephoto lens and I didn't have it with me. I still wanted to take this shot just as a memory, and you can see that with this faster shutter speed there's less streaking and much more the look of actual snowflakes. So what is the ideal shutter speed to use depending on what you want to achieve? I don't think there is a definitive answer to that, as it really depends on how fast the snow is falling, and wind speed can also have an effect on that too. My suggestions are to use something around 1/15th of a second as your starting point if you want to capture movement in the snow, and use 1/250th of a second as your starting point if you want to freeze the movement and see more of the actual snowflakes. You can adjust this a little bit depending on what works for you and the look you want depending on the actual scene and conditions you're photographing in. The last point that I want to talk about in this video is the importance of really looking for the smaller details, or looking for smaller sections of the landscape that really work well in these snowy conditions. I really do think that when there's snow on the landscape, there's compositions to be had everywhere, be it perhaps on a single branch of a tree, or to patterns in the snow itself, or perhaps even some blades of grass that are protruding from the untouched snow. In this clip here, you will see all the wonderful patterns amongst the snow, and by changing my perspective a little and focusing my attention in a very small area, I found a section that had a pleasing composition which was enhanced by the light, and it resembled a much larger mountain range. There is a nice flow through the image from the bottom to top, and the actual area I was photographing was probably less than 4 feet long, I reckon. Due to the focal length I was using and how close my camera was to this scene, it was quite difficult to photograph. I wanted everything sharp, so I had to take multiple images and focus stack them. Even doing that, I had to shoot at f/22 to get enough depth of field in each shot, otherwise blending them together would have been very difficult. So diffraction is a slight issue in such scenarios, but the image is still reasonably sharp and I'm pleased with the end result. So I really do hope that you've enjoyed watching this video and potentially found a few pointers that will be useful to you in your own photography next time you're out in those wonderful, magical, snowy conditions. If you have enjoyed watching or found it useful, please do consider giving the video a like rating to help my content. And if you've not yet subscribed to my channel, do consider subscribing. I really do appreciate you watching as always, and I'm going to finish this video by showing a few more snowy winter magical images which I hope you enjoy seeing. I really do love being out in those conditions. It's potentially my favourite conditions to be out in. It's a tough call between snow and fog for me, I think, but they're absolutely magical, and any time that I can get out in snowy conditions I'm absolutely delighted to do so. Again, thank you very much. I do appreciate you watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.